This is the third in a series of videos on characters within Sense and Sensibility. This one focuses on Lucy Steele. As before, you'll be asked to do two different things. In the first, pick out 5 key moments in what Lucy does or thinks or says is important, and then to pick out 5 quotations which provide different insight into her character. The aim is at the end of all of this, you're going to be able to write a terrific essay within your A-level examination. So stay tuned, you're watching Schofield on Shakespeare.
So, here's the first task to get you thinking in more detail about Lucy. Consider her role in the novel and write down 5 moments in what she does, says or thinks is important and or interesting. No need to use quotations, just summarise each moment in a single sentence using your own words. So press pause now, the video will resume in 5 seconds time. Here's my list, starting with the deliciously clever way Lucy superficially makes a friend out of the utterly unwilling Elinor by revealing her secret engagement to the man they both want to marry. Second, the moment Fanny hears about Lucy's engagement and has an absolute fit, which in the novel is narrated second-hand by Mrs. Jennings. Next is Lucy's preening, semi-literate letter to Elinor, reassuring her dear friend that the dreadful scene with Fanny and John has not weakened hers and Edward's great love. Fourth is short but well worth exploring. It's the message given by newly married Mrs. Ferrers to the Dashwood manservant in Exeter. Fifth and finally, Edward shows Elinor the letter Lucy wrote rather brusquely, breaking off their engagements. Let's explore these 5 moments in more detail, kicking off with this extract from Chapter 2 of Volume 1. I explored a different part of the same conversation in my video on Elinor. If you haven't seen that, it's worth a look. This is an earlier section, as I'm interested in the way Lucy prepares the ground for the revelation. So read this now and press pause. It's important to remember the state of Lucy and Elinor's relationship at this point. They have only very recently met in the previous chapter, and there has been no genuine warmth or natural connection made between them. Looking back at chapter 21, their exchanges have been characterised by regular pauses, Lucy's embarrassment at the vulgarity of her sister, and Elinor's adroit responses to Lucy's obsequious comments about the Middleton family. So Lucy and Elinor's relationship is emphatically not yet one, nor will it ever be, in which confidences will be expected or even welcomed. Yet Lucy knows that Elinor is a very real threat to her relationship with Edward, and that the sooner she passes on her implicit message that she should stop thinking of Edward as a possible future partner, the better. But how to broach such an intimate subject, given that, up until this point, they've only been making polite chit-chat within a group context? Well, firstly, Lucy herself draws attention to the unusual nature of the topic of conversation, which implies that she has good reasons for talking about something so unexpected. And then secondly, her actual question, although important to a secondary extent, is merely intended to pique Elinor's interest and to enable her to make the subsequent revelation that she is engaged to his son. This question acts as a pretext, a facilitator, so that Lucy can subsequently deliver the unspoken message, "Stay off my man." But of course, Lucy needs to deliver this message cautiously and carefully. So she skillfully gives a reason why Elinor might be able to answer her question, although not yet why she is asking something so strange. before repeating the question. This is a proficient operator. Someone carefully tuned into body language and prepared to tweak her course depending on what she sees or hears. She knows she needs to advance bit by bit, and having started off with her initial bombshell question, she spends some time superficially suggesting her respect for Elinor and her keenness for that respect to be returned. So my impression here of Lucy is that she is a formidable operator when it comes to the dark arts of manipulation. The narrator cum Elinor may be able to dismiss her as ignorant and illiterate, but her ability to flatter, to introduce her own agenda beneath the surface, make her a redoubtable opponent. Next key moment, and we move to Mrs. Jennings's breathless narrative in chapter 1 from volume 3. Elder sister Nancy has taken advantage of the apparent goodwill towards herself and her younger sister to reveal the truth about Lucy's engagements to Edward Ferrars. Here's what happened next. Read it through now and press pause. This passage is great fun to read and gives more of an insight into the author's attitude towards Fanny and her snobbishness than Lucy. The image of first Nancy and then John on their knees is slapstick comedy at its finest, making it impossible to take Fanny's reaction seriously. Each melodramatic moment, whether it is someone getting on their knees or someone falling afresh into hysterics, occurs in rapid succession, giving the impression of a comic set piece on a stage. It is impossible for the reader to take such condensed, over-the-top reactions seriously, leaving us to conclude that Fanny's reaction and snobbery are ridiculous, notwithstanding the fact that Lucy is clearly a ruthless character with minimal integrity. But Lucy plays her part of the distressed, deeply upset friend and fiancée here, as well as she does in all the other scenes of the novel. Whereas in my first moment she showed her ability to manipulate language, here she knows better than to plead her case at this point, and instead joins in with the general physical commotion and chaos. She knows that there are likely to be other occasions in the future in which she can begin to worm her way back. Just one final point on this extract, which is nothing to do with Lucy, but is probably one of my favourite lines in the novel. In the midst of all this screaming and fainting is henpecked, emasculated John Dashwood, walking about the room and not knowing what to do. This encapsulates his ineffectiveness in the novel as a whole. He fails in his responsibility to his father to adequately safeguard his stepmother and half-sister's futures, and from this point onwards is shown to be a caricature of self-centred impotence. My third moment is a letter. Lucy wants to reassure her dear friend that, in spite of the dreadful scene at the Dashwoods, all is well in her relationship with Edward. Read through this extract and press pause. Look at the length of that first sentence, 84 words. Packed with coordinating conjunctions, conjunctive adverbs, and subordinating conjunctions. The overall effect is of breathless comparative illiteracy, and of the writer being keen to say as quickly as possible that everything is fine with her relationship with Edward. So, implicitly again, don't even think about getting any ideas. Unlike, say, in Willoughby's albeit beneath the surface horrific letter to Marianne in chapter 7 from volume 2, or more positively Frank Churchill's letter to his stepmother in Emma, there is no pretence at a separate introductory sentence. Instead, there is a brief flash of feigned affection before moving unashamedly on to ram home the idea that Edward and herself are an unshakable unit, as seen in the repeated use of the first person plural. Lucy is hell-bent on what she hopes will torment Elinor as much as possible by constantly suggesting that it is Edward whose love is all-conquering. It is Edward who simply cannot live without her. She is desperate to paint herself as the object of Edward's unquenchable, never-ending love. Whereas the reality is, of course, that she has always been the one hell-bent on clinging to their past attachment with all of her manipulative might. But it's also worth pointing out again how good Lucy is at ingratiating herself with others. Now, Elinor may not fall for it, and she may despise her blatant flattering, but others are far less discerning. The narrator wryly observes that the letter may have been addressed to Elinor, but actually she knew it could potentially benefit her more in practical terms by being read by Mrs. Jennings. As ever, what is not directly said or spoken, but merely implied or anticipated, can be more significant than superficial surface meaning. Next moment is the chance meeting between the newly married Ferrarses and the Dashwood manservant following a trip to Exeter. Read this through now, pressing pause. Once again, we see the positive impression that Lucy Steele leaves on the less discerning. Here she has charmed otherwise well-meaning Thomas. But as ever with Lucy, it is what lies beneath what isn't directly said which is more significant. Only the rereader knows that at this point, the Mr. Ferrars she is referring to is Mr. Robert Ferrars. And the question is whether Lucy is still hell-bent on teasing and provoking her now former rival by allowing her to think that she has married Edward. Certainly, Elinor comes to believe that Lucy, knowing that she is unlikely to have received news of her change of marital partner from other quarters, wanted to deliberately mislead and provoke, unable to rid herself of gnawing feelings of inferiority, in spite of her extraordinary triumph. But Celia Easton, writing in Sense and Sensibility and the Joke of Substitution, is less convinced, suggesting instead that she may have simply been trying to pass herself off as the formal lady of elegance and fashion. Either way, the fact that the reader is also taken in allows for a more satisfying plot twist later on. The fact that Edward himself reveals his own single status results in wonderful, unexpectedly happy drama later on in the novel. My final moment takes place towards the very end of the narrative, although chronologically it is positioned earlier. Edward passes Lucy's grubby little note over for Elinor's perusal. Press pause to read it now. Once again, her lack of class and elegance is seen in the absence of a separate introductory sentence, and the undignified way she gets straight to her own selfish point. The opening subordinate clause overwhelmingly and characteristically puts the onus on Edward for the failure of their engagement. It is his fault. The second sentence incorrectly and abruptly misses out the subject, whilst the subsequent clauses sound petulant and childlike in the suggestion that blame may need to be apportioned in the future, and in the use of the clumsy, inelegant phrase makes proper. You also get the impression that Lucy would benefit from some lessons on how to use full stops correctly. The sentence on screen contains 66 words and has far too many disjunctive events and statements. The fact she now loves Robert completely, the fact they can't live without each other, the fact they're going to Dawlish for a few weeks, the fact Robert is desperate to see this place, the fact that she now needs to write this letter, etc., to be included within a single sentence. So the letter may be crass, abrupt, poorly written, and lack class. But the fact remains that Lucy has managed to get a man to marry her in record-fast time who had previously described her gloriously witheringly as the merest awkward country girl without style or elegance and almost without beauty. Lucy Steele is evidently a person who really does know how to make friends and influence people. Let's move on. In the exam, you will need to be able to wheel out actual quotations, giving very specific individual insights. So time for your second task. Reread sections of the novel before writing out 5 quotations which give different insight into what Lucy is really like. And to what extent is our narrator going to be reliable on this score? In order to ensure that you are revising as many different sections of the novel as possible, avoid quotations or sections of the text which have been used so far in this video. Press pause now to get started. So here's my first quotation, which is about the impression made by both the Steeles almost immediately after arriving at Barton Park. They happened to be so dotingly fond of children that Lady Middleton's good opinion was engaged in their favour before they had been an hour at the park. She declared them to be very agreeable girls indeed, which for her ladyship was enthusiastic admiration. The hint to the narrator's attitude lies in the first phrase. Rather than the simpler, unambiguous, they were so fond, we have, they happened to be so dotingly fond. The verb happen to be makes their fondness for children seem like a rather suspicious, convenient coincidence, whilst the adverb dotingly fond is tautological and excessive. The overall effect is that the narrator is questioning their sincerity and their motives. These sisters are determined to say and do anything whatsoever in order to gain the favour of those with money and influence. And the narrator seems to enjoy poking fun at the depths of debasement to which the Steele sisters will sink. This quotation is just about Lucy, who responds rapidly to Lady Middleton's hint about finishing a basket for her daughter Anna Maria. Lucy directly drew her work table near her and reseated herself with an alacrity and cheerfulness which seemed to infer that she could taste no greater delight than in making a filigree basket for a spoilt child. It is the excessive nature of phrases such as taste no greater delight and alacrity and cheerfulness in relation to something as tedious and repetitive as making a basket which convey the narrator's attitude towards Lucy. She is too acquiescent, too fake, too desperate to ingratiate that she loses all sense of self-worth. Her efforts are particularly cringeworthy given the direct description of the child as spoilt and therefore not worthy of or needing any further gifts or toys. But what Lucy does works. It isn't just Lady Middleton who approves wholeheartedly of her, but Fanny too, at least before she finds out about her secret engagement to Edward. Following John's suggestion that they would be expected to invite his sisters to stay with them in London, Fanny responds, "But I just settled within myself to ask the Miss Steeles to spend a few days with us. They are very well behaved, good kind of girls, and I think the attention is due to them, as their uncle did so very well by Edward." As ever, Fanny is being disingenuous and being economical with the truth in order to justify her selfish neglect of her husband's family. Back in chapter 3, there is surely some implicit criticism of Mr. Pratt's tuition, given that Edward has turned out so lacking in proper direction. Whilst her brother Robert is far more explicit about Edward's education, claiming in chapter 14 of volume 2 that it was an evil to send him to Mr. Pratt rather than Westminster School. But the fact Fanny is prepared to be disingenuous and go against her husband really does highlight how well Lucy has acted up until that point. She has painted herself as the grateful, interested, humble young girl, keen to learn from the taps of wisdom that can spout from those older and with far greater social connections than herself. Whereas the reality is different, as Fanny finds out later to her cost. Underneath the mask of innocent, happy gratitude lies someone hell-bent on making a better life for herself, even if it means scheming non-stop behind the scenes, and even if it results in her marrying a man she doesn't love and who doesn't love her. As Rebecca Richardson writes in Dramatising Intimacy, Confessions and Free Indirect Discourse in Sense and Sensibility, Lucy Steele is the ultimate schemer. She knows how to get things from people. This next quotation is taken at a point when she still believed she would be marrying Edward and moving to Delaford Parsonage. As for Colonel Brandon, she was not only ready to worship him as a saint, but was moreover truly anxious that he should be treated as one in all worldly concerns, anxious that his tithes should be raised to the utmost, and secretly resolved to avail herself at Delaford, as far as she possibly could, of his servants, his carriage, his cows, and his poultry. There's the characteristic fawning, as implied in the narrator suggesting she was ready to worship Brandon as a saint, followed closely by the characteristic self-interest. She would have no interest in his tithes being raised unless it directly impacted upon herself. She's looking ahead and planning in close detail the way she would be able to take advantage of Delaford Parsonage being so close to the main manor house. She plans to be able to regularly commandeer servants, carriage, cows, and poultry. And had she gone on to marry Edward and lived there, from what we have seen of her in the novel as a whole, she would have been successful in all those areas. But perhaps Lucy's self-interest is seen most brutally in my fifth and final quotation. This quotation is narrated by Mrs. Jennings, who reveals, "For Lucy, it seemed, borrowed all her money before she went off to be married, on purpose, we suppose, to make a show with, and poor Nancy had not 7 shillings in the world." So Lucy borrowed all of her only sister's money, leaving her completely stuck and unable initially to get back home to Plymouth. Within an unforgiving patriarchal world, it is one thing to take advantage of and leech from those already settled in life and socially smug. But to leave her own sister in the lurch like this, merely to make a show with, suggests that young Lucy Steele may well be a cold-hearted, ruthless bitch. And unlike principal characters in Austen's fiction, this one never learns the errors of her ways.
It looks like we've come to the end of this video exploring character within Jane Austen's Sense and Sensibility. I hope it's been useful. Many thanks for watching.